Yes, welcome everyone. I see more people joining us. Welcome to this web series on the decolonization of aid. Today we will reflect on the moral or ethic perspective. I will explain more about that of both aid and decolonization. My name is Kiza Magendane. I'm very happy to be your host today. I work in The Hague as a knowledge broker in the field of international development. We connect the world of who connect policy and practice and research in the field of international development. I also write for the leading Dutch newspaper NRC Handelsblad. Today, I will guide you through this ethical moral reflection on international aid and decolonization. First, I will invite Peter, Heinze, and Anna-Marie in a bit to say something about this series and what we have learned so far, because normally we have Professor Thea Hilhorst, who is the linking pin between through the whole series, but unfortunately she will not be able to join us because she's in Italy. Anna-Marie Hemskerk is a manager at Partos, the Dutch, she's manager, I have to look at my notes, Quality Learning and Innovation, the Dutch platform for development organization. Anna-Marie, welcome. Maybe a short reflection on what we have learned so far in this web series.
Thank you, Kiza. Yes, first I wanted to recall why we started this series. We wanted it to be a series of conversations and facilitated dialogue rather than a debate or discussion about decolonization. For me, it is about trying to understand how our colonial past still affects us, our mindsets and our relations before we can realize effective change. We talk a lot about how to shift power and what needs to change in donor requirements and in our strategic planning and programming, but why is it so difficult? What are these underlying patterns under our reality that makes it so difficult to realize the change we want to see? Before we can get rid of these patterns, we need to become aware of them. And this requires, I believe, dialogues with room for listening and reflection instead of argumentation. And I've been very happy with the 3 conversations so far. You're asking what we've learned. Well, we've learned that there are complex interlinkages between our colonial past and the humanitarian sector and the development sector. That they are difficult to disentangle, that it is also risky because we don't want to throw away the child with the bathwater. So how can we do that? In the next session, that was the first session where we looked at the historical perspective. And in the next session, which was about the decolonization of aid, looking at the development perspectives, we looked at how colonialism also resulted in power imbalances globally in the countries between communities, and addressing these power imbalances is a core business of development organizations, or at least it should be. But at the same time, we are part of this colonial system, the system that embeds all our behaviors, relations, and assumptions. And so we should make it a priority also to address these colonial aspects of the aid system.
Yes, and you organized this series with Partos and the International Institute for Social Studies. We have Professor Hilhorst is part of.
Yes,
I'm curious to hear from Peter Heinze, who is a coordinator of KUNO, the Dutch Humanitarian Knowledge Exchange Platform. We also reflected on the humanitarian perspective on decolonization, Peter. At the same time, one could say that in a way the whole series is about ethic. Could you share with us what we have learned so far and why very specific reflection on ethic today?
Thank you, Kiza. Yeah, there were many lessons. The first one was the historical perspective, that like Anna-Marie already shared, don't throw away the baby with the bathwater. We risk that we are throwing away everything what humanitarianism is doing nowadays. We should be really careful about it. That was the main lesson. The other one was True decolonization means that we should not understand the West as epicenter of humanitarianism. It's not all about the West. And that will come back, that came back in all the other sessions. It was really, really touching for me. Also in the second session about the development cooperation perspective, again, listen and follow the lead of local organizations and communities. And again, also in the third session about the humanitarian aid perspective, I think it was Tamam Aloudat who really impressed me and said decolonization could be an entire divorce of the idea that someone has a real idea what is better for the other. Stop paternalism, please stop paternalism. He was so clear about it. And then finally we touched upon a new topic. I thought the democratization of locally led responses. What could development cooperation or humanitarian aid look like when it should be a democratic issue? Well, that means a lot about accountability, how we manage the money and how we manage the responsibilities. So yeah, I think that are all ethical issues. You see here we have the overview of all the sessions we had so far. Today, the moral and ethical perspective, that doesn't mean we didn't touch upon moral and ethics so far, but I really hope we will learn more about the West as epicenter, who is deciding what development cooperation or humanitarian aid should look like. How could we change the way we are accountable for what we are doing? I'm ready to listen to Aarathi Krishnan and Hugo Slim and to you, Kiza. Please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited about this discussion. As Anna Maria explained, this series was started to facilitate a constructive dialogue. At the same time, I hope it creates some basis of discomfort, because I think, and we'll discuss about this, our position in this international aid system. Ethics is about decision-making in our daily life. It's about wrong and good, but at the same time, I hope about power relations and the abuse that come with it, also in this international aid industry. And what is the implications of our choices, especially if someone is advocating for decolonization? What does that actually mean? Does decolonization indeed mean throwing the baby away with the bathwater? All these kind of questions, we will reflect on them, we'll define what we understand under ethics, we'll reflect on paternalism, the word that Peter just mentioned, but also on how a decolonial relation would look like. Before I introduce the next speaker and explain to you what will happen, I would like to propose you a question, and I hope you think about it. Of course, the speaker will help me answer this question. And the question is, do you imagine an international aid system that is free from paternalism? Now, you could already share your answer in the chat. Do you imagine an international aid system that is free from paternalism? The answer to that question has many implications, and I hope we'll be able to answer them. And to answer these questions, we are very happy with two prominent speakers, Aarathi Krishnan, who is a strategic Foresight Advisor at the UNDP, and Hugo Slim, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict of the Oxford University. Both speakers will introduce, will share with us their reflection on ethics and morality of international aid and decolonization for 10 minutes. After that, we will go in much more details on what they've discussed. And in the last 30 minutes, 45 minutes, we hope to have an exchange with you, the audience. Without further ado, let me start with my first speaker, Aarathi Krishnan. I hope I pronounced your name right. Her work focuses on designing anticipatory institutions with a special focus on strategic foresight and system thinking. She's an affiliate at the Beckman Klein Center for International Security at Harvard University, and also a technology and human rights fellow at the Howard Carr Center for Technology and Human Rights. Her work, her research focuses on foresight and decolonial tech ethics and humanitarian tech governance. Aarathi, we are very happy to have you. This was a very brief introduction of your work. Please share with us, bring us through the journey of your ethical reflections.
Great. Thank you so much, Kiza. And thank you, Peter, Anne-Marie, Hugo. It's a thrill and a privilege to be here with you. Of course, we've crossed paths in previous careers as well. So my name is Aarathi Krishnan. I research at Harvard on the intersection between the coloniality of tech systems and in humanitarian aid, and what does that mean for how we think about ethics and governance structures. I've been reflecting a lot. I've worked in the humanitarian sector for almost 20 years now, in various different roles. And I guess where I land in the conversation of decoloniality, and that's sort of the phrase that I use, is there are three things that really strike me in this conversation. And I don't want to repeat stuff that was talked about in the previous sessions. Tamam, in particular, whom I greatly admire, does hit the nail on the head when he talks about paternalism. But I want to talk about, what does the fundamentals of coloniality mean within this aid system? And it becomes, yes, there's donor issues, there's funding issues, but there is a fundamental personal lens to this. And how we see this translate in the aid system is that we see solutions being proffered in the name of and for the good of perceived people that are at different stages of vulnerability or at different stages of need, yet those people themselves, people that look like me, that come from the parts of the world that I come from, are not recognized as full and legitimate participants in producing those solutions. Colonialism was proffered as ideas of modernity without necessarily thinking about those impacts of modernity, whether that was actually wanted or needed. One of my favorite researchers at Harvard is a gentleman called Sabelo Malambi. And Sabelo, proffers this provocation where he says, what is the use, or what is the good of human rights frameworks when we don't recognize the humanity in others? So one of the key principles for me when I think about my journey in this space is the idea of positionality. What is the gaze that we put on the world when we make the decisions we make, and the choices that we make? And do we recognize the humanity of others in that? Now, colonialism, the argument of decolonization, is often packaged as a diversity. It sort of gets folded up as diversity and inclusion, more people around the table. It's often a binary argument between white and people of color. But I would argue that aspects of positionality also influence that. I'm a person of color. I was born in Malaysia. I grew up in Australia. I now live in New York. I have a certain amount of privilege. The gaze that I have of the world and the position that I hold influences the decisions that I make. I cannot be preferred to speak on behalf of others that may look like me or come from the parts of the world that I come from. And these are arguments we don't normally have. The argument of coloniality isn't just between race. It's about caste. It's about class. And these are also elements of the argument we don't have. The second point I want to say here is around, where do ethics fall into this? And the idea of the principles of ethics I fundamentally believe in. There's a lot of what my research is focused on. But one of the things that I am, I guess, unlearning through this process is this idea of whose ethics. For what purpose? Who does these ethics benefit? Do ethical philosophies actually link to how different community values and how they see themselves? And I want to draw on ideas of Ubuntu philosophy, for example. Ethical frameworks traditionally are European in origin. They speak about being logical, being relational. Ubuntu philosophy often draws on this idea that I am a person through other persons. I am because we are. And it forces us to earn our personhood through how we treat others. How do ethical philosophies that we use in humanitarian aid draw on these types of frameworks, or different types of philosophical cultural frameworks that might help expand our worldview of what is right or what is wrong and who gets to determine that? It's those decision-making structures. And I guess the last part I want to talk about here is, we've often drawn on the fundamental principles. I've worked in the Red Cross, Red Crescent for many years, as has Hugo. We've drawn on the Geneva Conventions for a very long time as the fundamental principles that govern the work we do. And the provocation I want to put out here is these principles, these conventions, human rights frameworks were designed at a specific point in time with a specific group of people that sat behind its writing, its thinking. It's not that it is wrong. The question I want to ask is it still fit for purpose for the complexities we are facing? And it's not about saying they have to be diminished, but how might we evolve? How might we amplify? How might we elevate our current conventions and frameworks to be more, not just inclusive, but to be firmly grounded in aspects of rights, justice, and action orientation? So that we're not imposing one, using Tamam's words, one paternalistic idea of how the world should be onto different parts of the world. So those are the three things that I really think about. Our positionality in the conversation around colonialism, decolonialism, whose ethics matter and who gets to determine those ethics, and how do we actually embrace, and this is a key part of my practice and my research, a pluriversal approach to this, to existing in a multiverse, so to speak, which is that multiple truths can be true at the same time, and whose ethics do we prioritize? And finally, the frameworks and principles that we have in place, are they fit enough for the future that we're going into? And how might we elevate it? How might we elevate conversations about neutrality? How might we elevate conversations about universality that not just are looking forward, but are built from what we've learned in the past? I'm going to end with this one quote that has stuck with me for a very long time. Anasuya Sengupta, who is one of the co-founders of an organization called Whose Knowledge, and what they do is to democratize the internet's language so that it is accessible to everybody. It's not just in English. And on a panel discussion with Anasuya many months ago, Anasuya put forward this provocation that, very often when we think about the future, when we think about ideas of what could happen, when the idea of Wakanda is often held up as a great beacon of hope, Anasuya's argument is what is powerful about the idea of Wakanda is not about its future possibility, but it's about the past possibilities of what could have happened if colonialism didn't happen. What could have been in place if the world didn't plunder, didn't colonize, didn't extract in the name of one part of the world for the sake of the other, and didn't impose one idea of progress onto the world. And that was really powerful. I'll stop there. I hope these are good discussion points to get us started, and really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much. I hope that question, the last question, also go to the list of the audience. How would the world look like? And at the same time, maybe in a more active form, I hope that this conversation help us reshape our world structures and work toward a more pluralistic system. So a lot to digest. I'm looking forward to the exchange. This is the time, I think, to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Hugo Slim, who is Senior Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. He's specialized in ethics, war and humanitarian aid. In his career has combined academia, frontline humanitarian operations, and policy making. He has published over 30 referred journal papers and 17 book chapters in ethics, humanitarianism, and war studies. In his last book, Humanitarian Ethics, A Guide to Morality and Aid in War and Disaster, published in 2015, he thinks through the applied ethics of humanitarian action. And again, this is a very short summary. Dr. Hugo Slim, welcome. Please inspire us.
Kiza, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to follow Aarathi and to share this platform with her. I want to talk in three parts really as well. I want to talk a bit about my background, my colonial background, my imperial background. I want to talk about my views succinctly on the rights and wrongs of the current system, and so talk about self-determination as a right. And I want to try and suggest some sort of ethical steps we might take as we decolonize. First, I was asked by Peter to bring some photos, so we better put them up. So I've got two photos which are meant to sort of illustrate my theme a little, if René can put them up. And the first one, and I just leave you to think about, the first one is 1902 in London, and that is in the middle, Joseph Chamberlain, the colonial secretary of Great Britain, and gathered around him at the Imperial Conference in London in 1902 are the prime ministers of all the white settler colonies, like Australia, where Aarathi partly grew up, and New Zealand and other places, and the secretaries of the colonies and war, and they were discussing how to run the world. And then the next picture is over 100 years later, and that is the meeting and the group photo of the Interagency Standing Committee principles in Geneva in 2019. And in a sense, I always think that that group comes together also as the leaders of the world to discuss how the West should run the aid world and, in a sense, the challenge that we face of colonization. It's a much more diverse group. It has slightly different intentions, but there does seem to be the resonance there that we're partly discussing. So René, thank you for those two photos, 1902 colonialism and today's humanitarian colonialism, perhaps. I speak today really as part of the older generation of humanitarians, and I also speak very specifically as a white British humanitarian raised in a colonial tradition. So I'm going to start with my background a bit, and I started as a humanitarian worker in 1983. And I come from an imperial colonial family. So just to give you a glimpse, one set of my grandparents lived their lives in India, in the Indian Army, and my father was born in Quetta in Pakistan and grew up there until he was 18, 19. On the other side, my other grandparents lived their lives in the Middle East as colonialists in the Middle East, but commercial ones. So running supermarkets and shops across the Middle East. And my mother was born in Nazareth, in Palestine, and lived a lot of her life out in the Middle East as well. I had one great uncle who spent 35 years in Uganda as in the colonial service, and eventually became deputy governor of Uganda. And I had another great uncle who was sent in disgrace to Malaysia, actually, Aarathi, to be a rubber planter, because he fell in love with a divorced woman in Edinburgh, which was unacceptable. So that's my sort of family background, and that's the sort of culture I grew up in, a culture of empire. And I think it's interesting to remember that empire, throughout human history, has been the dominant political organization across the world at all times, really. We've had Chinese empire, Persian empire, Greek, Roman, Muslim, Mongol, Ottoman, Russian, Habsburg, and American. But probably there is something especially unpleasant about these short, overseas, white settler empires. And perhaps because the racism was so distinct in those empires, the white, brown, black racism, which you didn't get so much in the land empires, Ottomans and others. The colonization of the mind was so intense in those relationships, as Aarathi has pointed out, in those white settler empires. The cultural difference was huge because these imperialists crossed seas, whereas the land empires were often with their neighbors and of great cultural similarity very often. And of course, the slavery was on industrial scale in those white settler empires. So in 1983, I became a humanitarian in a British imperial tradition. It was considered a strange job that I should join Save the Children, but an understandable job because people had always crossed the seas and tried to run other countries. When I joined Save the Children in 1983, the Director General was the former permanent secretary of the Colonial Service, And 3 of the 4 directors of Save the Children were ex-military people who'd fought in the decolonization wars for Britain. But interestingly, they were, if you like, enlightened decolonizers. And their mission was to try and enable independence. And in that process, and in the years afterwards, I became, I suppose, a bit more radical in my view. I want to now move from that because, in a sense, that's the tradition I come out of. And I say that and I share that with you because it is, I think, and Aarathi talked about the importance of taking this issue personally, it is a personal manifestation of the wider history of Western humanitarianism, that a lot of us shared that mindset, came from that root. In the last 10 years, I have recognized and felt imperialism and colonialism in Western humanitarianism to a degree I've not known it before, even in that post-imperial period. I think the scale of the footprint of Western humanitarianism in certain countries now is so enormous. I think that ideology that Aarathi talked about, this imposition of this sort of specific set of principles and ideology, is so much more intense than it ever was in the 80s and 90s when I started. And this is why I've become very critical of it. And quite frankly, humanitarian imperialism is wrong. And much greater humanitarian self-determination is right. So for me, the core point, the core ethical issue here is that a people and a nation's right to organize and run their own society. And this is expressed in the human rights covenants, of course, from the 1960s, that every people and every nation should freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And I think that commitment to self-determination sets us on a road to the kind of pluriverse that Aarathi is talking about. So people have a right to shape and lead their own humanitarian institutions and organizations. But this right also comes with duties. And of course, if we're talking about humanity and protecting and respecting others, anyone who runs a humanitarian organization has a duty to create effective and impartial organizations. So humanitarian self-determination must still determine itself as humane and humanitarian. And the money they receive is for humanitarian results. And so self-determination cannot self-determine as inhuman, partial, and corrupt forms of humanitarian organizations. So there is an ethical line, there's an absolute right to self-determination, but there's also a really important obligation to self-determine as a humanitarian organization. And it's interesting thinking of Afghanistan today, the Taliban are going to self-determine Afghanistan now. And it'll be the acid test if they can self-determine Islamist humanitarian organizations, because I have no doubt they will gradually over the next year or so squeeze out the NGOs who are feeling rather triumphant at the moment because they've got lots of photos of meeting Taliban leaders, but I think they'll be squeezed out or squeezed into a different shape. And there are duties for international organizations as well. First of all, to show solidarity and support for self-determination. That is the primary duty of an international organization, not to subjugate or dominate a national humanitarian organization or a local one, but to enable it and grow it. So finally, what is ethical decolonization? And I also agree that you can tell I'm not a revolutionary kind of person in that year zero way. So I don't think a revolutionary year zero, total wiping away of internationalism, kicking everybody out, starting again, form of decolonization will be right. I think that will be wrong because it will be too destructive and create more suffering. So we need to have a pathway somehow of a handover, a transition to conserve what is good and change what is bad. And this has to be a real and careful change in power. And I was thinking of 7 principles to guide it. And these are just me thinking, and of course they're Western logical thinking that Aarathi can rightly challenge. But my first principle of any transition is it must be fast change. It has to be fast for two reasons: to remedy injustice, which is happening all the time by a colonial system, and to act prudently now to create the national organizations we need for the climate crisis. Because international organizations and colonial humanitarianism will not meet the climate crisis challenge. The second principle must be one of mutual care. I think growing new organizations, creating and self-determining national organizations will be very hard. And so will shrinking international ones. So there has to be an understanding and ethics of mutual care where both parties agree that what they're doing is difficult, and they have to have compassion, in a sense, for one another, one that's growing, one that's shrinking. The third principle is to preserve what works well. Some forms of internationalism, some forms of hybrid organizations are good, they're acceptable, they have people's consent, and they should be preserved if they're working, and not ideologically demolished because they have an international element. The fourth principle, I think, is results matter, but mistakes are expected. So self-determination must deliver humanitarian results, but it too will not be perfect. So it too will make mistakes like colonial international agencies make mistakes. And the fifth thought I had is this important point that all of you have spoken about already: a change of mind. And I think it's got to be a rule that every single humanitarian works on changing their mindsets. And this is particularly important about, for people who experience a sort of inferiority complex because of the imperialism and the colonialism, and people who enjoy a superiority complex. Both those have to change, and we have to find a mindset of equality as humanitarians. And we have to work towards the sixth principle, which must be humanitarian cooperation. Whatever international and national does must be based on people's needs, not institutional power play. And then the final thing, the final rule of thumb, I think, is that there must remain a right to subvert and resist. Because if self-determination determines into an inhumane form of misgovernance and bad humanitarian structures, there must be a right to resist those and subvert those national structures when they're wrong. And equally, if internationalism consistently refuses to change, there is a right to subvert it and resist it much more forcefully, in my view, and realize that a gentle transition will not work. So I'll leave it there and hope there's something there to talk about.
Thank you very much. I've been taking a note, and I hope that people who are following us also took those notes on the 7 principles, and that we can discuss them further. I do realize that Aarathi also had an image, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe you could guide us through your visuals and how it's related to your message on ethics of decolonization.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kiza. Thank you, Hugo. Yes, my image is actually an image of a South American emerging philosophy called Buen Vivir. It's informed a lot of my thinking and my research in terms of unsettling the coloniality of the work that I do. So Buen Vivir, it's a concept and a lived practice that's currently under construction. It's not finite, which is what I love about it. It's emergent. It is the opposite of the approach that we normally take, which puts a dollar figure on national well-being by utilizing a range of indicators to measure it, the way we normally do now in terms of what considers growth and progress. What's interesting about Buen Vivir is it draws not on the well-being of an individual, which one would argue when we prioritize the well-being of individuality, it results in inequity. But rather it talks about the well-being of the individual within the community in relation to specific cultural, natural environments. It is fundamentally a decolonial stance, and it draws on new ethics that balances quality of life, the democratization of the state, and the concern and its link with biocentric ideals. So it's this idea of the link between planet, between people, that I really like, and it informs a lot of it's influenced, and it has I guess inspired my thinking about what new forms of what the next could be in my world. Yeah. Thank you, Kiza.
Thank you very much. And that is also related to the notion of plurality. I see some interesting questions coming in, and I'll present them. First, I noticed that you both speak about the importance of positionality and personal position, and how that influence how we look at these issues. We have in the decolonization debates, similar patterns where people actually focus on how people look. Certain people should not have a say in this kind of debate. Starting with you, Aarathi, how do you look at those developments? And maybe a bit further, is there a possibility where the attempt to decolonize could in itself lead to unethical practices?
Absolutely. In relation to your second question, absolutely. One of the things that I've always reflected on, and I say this as someone that's always worked within fairly large institutions. The very systems we're saying is fraught at the moment. So I also recognize that where I sit and the systems I work in uphold a particular type of power structure. And it's very different trying to drive change from within those types of structures and sitting outside those structures. It's not a binary argument. They're both equally important. But one of the things that I have found that I reflect on a lot is in humanitarian agencies, there are teams that are absolutely dedicated, as Hugo has in his career, to think about the ethics of aid, to think about the principles of aid, and how we should do our work, and the values in which that work ought to be carried out. Those teams and those people is really far removed from the rest of the people, the rest of the organization and institutions that are sometimes carrying out that very work. And as somebody that sat in programming teams, that sat in innovation teams, that sat in tech teams myself, the questions that we are debating today, that we have the privilege and the luxury to really consider and reflect and think about today, when you're designing programs, when you're implementing programs, more often than not, staff members are not having these considerations. They're not having these conversations. If it has to be a very conscious, intentional design to weave it into program design and implementation, because more often what ends up it being a checkbox exercise. So that idea about positionality also means the responsibility to carry with me those these considerations, these principles, these things, and to have the strength and the resilience to push back on the system when the rest of the system is saying, no, we have to move fast. This program has to be implemented straight away, do a checkbox exercise. And of course, I'm generalizing here, but the reality of the thinking versus the doing is a wide gap. I think we also assume, so there's 2 points I want to make here. Often I think that humanitarians may often assume that we signed up to do this work, so we're all the same kind of people, and that's not true. I do not know how many rooms I've sat in where I've been the only woman or the only woman of color, or where even I went to school might impede or amplify the kind of right I have to have a conversation in a room. Do we give spaces for people to not have to minimize their accent, minimize how they look so that they fit in? So even within institutions themselves, these ideas of positionality come through. And the last point I just want to say, which is really supporting Hugo's point around that we all have to unshackle the coloniality of our minds. One of my processes that I've been going through is unlearning my own mental models. But one of the things that I often think about is, we all in the humanitarian space, we signed up to change the world, but we never thought we'd have to change ourselves as part of that process. And I think that's sometimes the hardest thing. Often we talk about the change that has to happen over there for those people, rather than how do we need to unshackle the not just our mental models, but our behaviors, our values, to truly be justice oriented. And what I would love to see is where humanitarian aid programs, humanitarian institutions, local, that we are justice oriented, and we're designing for equity, not just equality, but for equity. And maybe that's the next elevation of our work. I'm not sure.
Yes, I remember you wrote a blog post about that in January, reflecting on this very specific point. And we are happy to share that in the report about this webinar. Before I go to Hugo, maybe to push a bit further on that, because you also note that we should prevent the box checking mentality where we only focus on diversity and inclusion. But I can understand that some organizations who are dealing with these kind of questions have to start somewhere, especially from the understanding that people have different backgrounds, different experiences, that it might enrich their organization to actually bridge that gap between what you describe as the doing and the thinking, or the old and the new generation. And that's why organizations are more and more working towards diversity. Do you understand that the logic behind that development? Aarathi, you're muted.
Sorry, I thought you were posing that question to Hugo.
No, that was before I got to Hugo, because it's related to something that you say, and one that
yeah.
we should.
I think being more inclusive and equitable in our approaches is essential. And that does include ensuring that we are more intersectional in our inclusion efforts, etc. But let's not confuse the two. Decolonization is not diversity and inclusion, nor is it a replacement for social justice efforts. I think it's Wayne Yang and Eva Tuck speak about this a lot, if you want to look up their work. And I think we often conflate the very necessary efforts we're all going through to be anti-racist, to shift the power, to then think about decoloniality as part of that. But often these are very different things. So let's be clear what our objectives are.
Could you please clarify a bit, because you are talking about decoloniality, decolonization, anti-racism, and in the debate we try to combine all these concepts as part of the same struggle. Could you maybe, for the audience, bring us through how you use this concept and the implications?
Sure. So let's talk about colonization. Colonization was fundamentally the act of taking away people's agency, people's rights, people's land ownership, people's access to education. It was an axis of coloniality that covered various aspects of people's personhood. And both physical and mental. And of course, Hugo talked a lot about what those impacts and implications are. So in my view, the act of decolonization is part of that, is to give back, is the act of reparations, right? And decolonizing activists, that's what they argue for. Decolonization activists talk about the act of reparations as part of that mental model, or as part of that philosophy. Would humanitarian aid ever engage in the act of reparations? I don't know.
I hope you answer that question at the end. Luckily, I have that on my list.
Yes. So I mean, I think it's a valid question. If we're going to have an argument about decolonization, where is the argument about reparations as part of that, right? Decolonization in aid, where is the argument for reparations? Now, one can argue that, could reparations be folded up in how we're talking about how aid funding is transferred? Potentially. But I think it's a very, very important argument, and one we should debate, and one we should invest into understanding better.
Yes.
Decoloniality, on the other hand, is the act of elevating how we pursue, how we embody, how we access, and what knowledge we prioritize. So the principles of pluriversality for me exist in that. So to me, my work, and I'm not arguing one or the other. I'm just, again, multiple truths can be true at the same time. My practice is embedded in the space of decoloniality because I want to understand better multiple sources of truth, multiple sources of knowledge to expand our worldview about how we understand things like rights, ethics, aid, so that we are much better informed and we're not just coming from one hegemonic knowledge source. To be anti-racist is to be anti-racist. How do we not be racist in our acts, in how we treat others, in how we recruit? Do we recruit in our own image? Do we make people feel safe? Do we make people feel that they belong? And these are efforts that are absolutely integral. Again, part of a conversation around decolonization, but it's not decolonization. It's a very specific, much needed piece of work by itself.
Yes.
Diversity and inclusion, of course, is diversity and inclusion. And of course, now we're seeing the push to become intersectional in our diversity and inclusion efforts. You know, I've worked in organizations where diversity and inclusion teams were led by white women in the North. And their idea of what being safe meant was through the lens that they put out in the world, which isn't the gaze that is inflicted on me and others that look like me or others that come from similar type backgrounds, or even the gaze that we would put on you, Kiza, or Hugo, the stereotypes we might put on you. So yeah, for me, those are the sort of different pillars of this. They're not, we tend to wrap it up in the same paper, I suppose. They're not binary, they all interlink. Yes. But that's sort of how I process my thinking around this, and I guess where I focus my efforts.
Yes, thank you very much for unpacking that, because indeed there is a danger on focusing on, for instance, diversity and inclusion, and then conclude that you have worked toward a decolonial organization. I've seen Hugo nodding. I also had a question for you on the personality and positionality, but I can imagine that you have some reflection on what Aarathi just shared, because it was quite a lot to digest.
Yes, thank you. I think I totally agree with what Aarathi just said, and particularly this point about positionality, and that we all have to take this seriously every day. And you know, I would just add to that that really means leaders as well. So in ethical terms, if you're leading an organization, you have a greater moral responsibility to act against the colonial aspects of aid and the imperialist and racist aspects. And I totally agree with what you've both just said, that, you know, doing diversity is not doing decolonization. And if I'm honest, I think a lot of the humanitarian leaders of the big agencies have deflected the decolonization challenge into diversity. And that is morally, you know, not sufficient, and it's actually morally negligent. And I am not hearing the leaders of the big agencies really making commitments to decolonization and localization. I am hearing it from the Federation of the Red Cross. I hear it from the church networks. This is in the Western tradition. I hear it from Oxfam. I don't hear it from the ICRC. I don't particularly hear it from UNICEF or WFP or others. I am beginning to hear it from administrator power at USAID. And I think that is quite interesting, because that's big money that could be beginning to shift. But these other leaders, I think, are morally negligent in the way that they have not picked up the challenge, and they've deflected it towards diversity and haven't addressed the structural obligations they face to shift the power and shift their business model. So that's the positionality of leaders that I would say, you know, 50% are getting it and doing it, and 50% are ignoring it and deflecting it.
Before I ask further about your position that you explicitly mentioned, Hugo, on your colonial background and your position as a white male, could you maybe explain us about this, the position of organization now? Because it was quite interesting what Aarathi mentioned about the different groups within organization, that some groups might be what you called enlightened and want to work toward on these processes, but they may face leadership that's not willing or not ready to listen to this kind of conversation. Is there something that you can tell us about that based on your experience?
Well, I would just agree again. I mean, my experience would be the same, that, you know, you get big organizations and they're often internally contested. And, you know, if you want to really drive change in an organization, you need to be quite clever. And you know, a lot of your time is on internally trying to make change happen. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. More often than not, I think, you know, events come to pass where change is thrust upon people. And I think a bit of that has happened, you know, to some organizations, but not yet to others. But I would agree that it's, you know, there are often competing views. And I also agree with what Aarathi said, is that a lot of people are just, you know, not engaged in it because they're getting on with their job and they're being good administrators, good budget managers, good water people, good health people, whatever. And that's why I do think that her challenge to make everyone stop up and think, you know, I'm a water engineer, I'm an IT person, I'm a budget person, but I still have to take this issue seriously because I might be involved in an injustice. I think, moving on, I think the other big change that's going to happen is that I think the pluriverse that Aarathi's talking about may actually be geopolitically manifesting itself, because in the great power shift that's happening around the world now, and the end of the liberal US hegemony, if we talk Gramsci, you know, I think we're going to see huge areas of the world, and they're almost like new empires, Chinese influence, Russia still exactly holding its ground. You know, India has always held its ground and pushed out humanitarianism of the West and that sort of thing. We're going to see forms of humanitarian aid self-determine in these structures. So we're going to see authoritarian humanitarianism. We're going to see Islamist humanitarianism in Afghanistan, as we've seen it in other places. So that pluriverse will manifest geopolitically and politically. And I do think that Western humanitarianism is now going to shrink. Its sphere of influence is going to reduce. And as we have climate change and climate crisis, you know, there's going to be huge crises across huge parts of the world where the West has no reach. And the Western system that we're all obsessed and worried about has no reach. So the big question there is, what will these systems of authoritarian humanitarianism, Islamist humanitarianism be?
I think in a way you're already touching on the point that I want to discuss on the role of humanitarian and development organizations in the world that we live in, and the point of equity that Aarathi mentioned. I see at the same time really interesting contribution, for instance, Smuri Patel. By the way, I think, Peter, if you want, you could give Mr. Patel the audience to, because I cannot read everything, to make a contribution. As Peter is doing that, Hugo, I already mentioned that I would come to the point of positionality, because you was very explicit and you started about your own personal background, talking about maybe unethical implications of the debate of decolonization. How do you look at sometimes harsh and very controversial position where your background in itself becomes a problem, where someone might tell you, Mr. Hugo Slim has nothing to say because he's a white British man. How do you look at this kind of debates?
Well, I think they probably don't say that enough, actually. I mean, I am genuinely, you know, I think people should say, no, we don't want Hugo on the panel. You know, we know what he's going to say. And it's interesting, you know, I listen to myself after listening to Aarathi, and, you know, she rightly talks about the Western specificity of a certain logical mind and principles. And then what do? I list 7 principles at the end of the way we should reorganize decolonization. So, you know, I am at one level a lost cause in that way. But again, you know, Aarathi used the phrase of unlearning. And, you know, it may be surprising to some how much perhaps I have unlearned from where I started back in 1983. Whether I'll manage to unlearn any more, I don't know. But, you know, the challenge for each of us, positionally, I think, is to keep changing, to keep trying to work out what is right as the world changes, and to be ready sometimes to say, you know, I've been part of something wrong. or I'm worried I am now part of something that is getting more wrong. And I think that's where I position myself at the moment. Aid for me is too international, and the Western dominance of the ideology of aid is now excessive, and we need everything Aarathi said. We need different ideas, different models. We need Ubuntu aid, etc., etc.
Before we touch on that very specific point on principles, and I see that Aarathi also has a comment. Maybe for Mrs. Patrell, who was very active in the chat, and also people agreed with her. Please, could you please contribute with us?
Yes, hi Hugo and Aarathi. It's nice to be back here. Yeah, Hugo, your points on these seven, 8 principles, great ideas. I guess one of the things that is a huge problem is about who makes the decisions about some of these things. So one of the questions I had around, the subversive behavior and who will be the police, who will be the keeper, because that's the issue that's been in the system the whole time, right? The top-down ways of implementing principles and somehow being the one who points out or blames. And I think that's a big issue, because that goes down to power. I think we need to have more discussions around personal power and reflections on that. And we've been doing some of that work, but interestingly enough, middle level staff and lower level staff are really interested in that, would love to do that, but it's the leaders who are hanging behind. So how do we move the leadership forward? That would be the big question for me. Thank you very much. I would love to hear from both Hugo and Aarathi as well. Thank you.
Yes, very short, Hugo and Aarathi, on that very sharp question. Thank you very much, Ms. Patel.
Who's first? Aarathi?
It doesn't matter, really.
Hugo, you go first, that's fine.
So, Smriti, thanks very much. And I just read your very good piece before I came on this webinar, and I hope others will read it too, that you published today. On the subversive thing, who decides who's subversive? I don't think there is any great, great judge in the sky that can do this. For me, if the new military dictatorship in Myanmar is determining a state and a structure which just completely ignores people and sees hundreds of people unvaccinated, dying, whatever, then I think there is a really strong moral argument that others should subvert that system and rush in and try and engage humanitarian aid through other systems that are also resisting it. So I think it depends. And I think the other way around, if, as I said, if certain agencies just refuse to begin to decolonize and change their business model and their ideology, then they must be challenged. People must refuse to work with them, or, make it quite plain that what they're doing is not good enough in ethical terms. So, I think it's a moral call people will have to make. In terms of moving the leadership, some will move on. So we hope that there's an intergenerational dimension to where generational change will bring change. We hope that. Others will have, a change of mind, either a genuine one or because of political interest. And others will just have to be challenged from insider and outsider strategies to change their organizations, change their positions. But it's hard to do.
Thank you. Aarathi?
Thanks, Kiza. Thanks, Smriti. How do we change leadership? I mean, I guess that's the million-dollar question, really, isn't it? What I don't know if I've got a eloquent answer for that. What I do know is that we often talk about change in our sector, there's a centrality of our assumptions that underpins those conversations. We still assume the centrality of our roles. Everybody else has to change, but we will remain the same. We will remain the intermediary between donor to end user. We will, still be the main project designer. We talk about everybody else has to change except the centrality of the organization. So when we're talking about power shifting, I also want to unpack what that means and what that looks like. And I think we also need to have a conversation around trade-offs. And Hugo touched on this as well earlier. What are the trade-offs that we can live with? What are the trade-offs we can't live with? Because these do have fiduciary implications, they have accountability implications, etc. And I think for me, the crux of all of it all is the centrality of our role, that we think we are indispensable. Fundamentally, humanitarians are indispensable, or humanitarian system as it looks like now is indispensable. I'm not going to argue whether that's right or wrong or what it could look like, but I'd much rather think about what is the next version of this that could work within that, within the sort of pillars and parameters that we work with. On a personal level, when it talks about leadership, one of the things Hugo, my family worked on those rubber plantations. My grandfather was brought over from Kerala to Kuala Lumpur to work on building the railroads, and then died from building those railroads. I come from, my development in humanitarian aid was never a vocation. It was deeply personal, because but for my mom working 3 jobs to send me to university, there people you talk about, let's count the amount of brown women in the room. That's my grandmother. That's my great-grandmother. That is my ancestral history. And we stand on the shoulders of those that come before us, good or bad. And one of the things that I learn and what I try to practice in my leadership style is really simple. Don't draw the drawbridge up. I may have reached a certain point in my career. I may have, have a certain amount of privilege. And so now I have a manifest responsibility and obligation to make it easier for the next generation that comes after me. That's my obligation today. So if I want to see a shift in leadership, that's the shift I would love to see. Those that are making it easier and making it an obligation for those that's going to come after them. It's that thinking about intergenerational fairness, intergenerational equity, and how we bring that into our leadership style, and not just holding on for the sake of, I've made it here now, so nobody else. I'm not going to make it easier. I had to be more. I had to fight the good fight to get to where I am. So I'm not letting go of control. And it's that letting go of control, I think, that is something we need to unlearn. One of the things I think about the localization debate, and it was the point I wanted to come back to Hugo on, we often talk about, let's be participatory, let's get more people around the room, etc. One of the things, even with localization, etc., one of the things I want to put forward here is how much of all our participatory efforts actually influences decision-making. We sometimes think that the more diverse views we get around the room, we will listen better. But how much does listening better actually influence that when push comes to shove and we have to make decisions about what funding is going where, who is getting that funding, who resource mobilization, resource allocation, all of those sorts of things. When am I going to speak up and when am I going to shut up? Like all of those sorts of things. How does it fundamentally influence decision making? And one of the things that I think is fundamental through all of this is we can talk of all the tools and approaches in the world, but institutions don't change because it's the right thing to do. Institutions change because there's a viable alternative model that they can change into. So as part of these efforts, as much as I am very much oriented towards justice and social good and justice and equity, I also realize that for us to make this a tangible truth and a tangible reality, we have to come up with a viable alternative model. And so let's do that. That's what I'm interested in unpacking.
Yes, talking on that alternative model, because the point of global inequality and power structures and the distribution of good has been touched on. The very nature of the current international aid system is based on the donor and receiver relationship, which brings me back to the very first question that I shared with the audience. Can we imagine even a system in which paternalism is not possible? For both of you, how how would you answer that question, given the fact that so as far as we understand, the system is that the money comes from one place to another place. There is a donor and a receiver. And it's also touching on the point of self-determination that Hugo was explaining, and the point of localization, or even the word democratization was being mentioned. How can we reach there when the very nature of our current world system is that the donor has, the taxpayer here in the Netherlands, for instance, the Minister of Development Cooperation has to explain how the funding are being spent. So accountability is toward the citizens of the so-called donor country. So how could we work in a system without paternalism, or is that just a dream? And Hugo, I see you are thinking.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important question, because I think the money does determine a lot of this, and who has the money and who gives the money. That's a very powerful thing. I think ideally what we would say is that, eventually we want a different understanding that, once this money is given by taxpayers in the West, by governments, whatever, the money in a sense belongs to the people who need it, so to the suffering communities. It is in a sense held in trust by others for them. So it's not this institution's money or that institution's money. It's money, this is the old British charitable model actually, held on trust for the people who need it. So really it's their money, and it must be wisely used by everybody. I think before we get there, I think it's very difficult. And it's difficult for two reasons. First of all, because once institutions have money, they want to exercise power. It's just sort of how humanity works, I think. And so they begin to take power and try and shape things, whether that's an NGO or a UN agency. The other problem with it is I think it's very clear that this money is not seen simply as belonging to suffering people by Western governments or any other government. And it is, part of Western influence. So it actually is not solely humanitarian money. It is political influence money. It's about extending Western values. It's all the soft power stuff. So, that is going to be a huge challenge. I have no doubt about that. But then going back to leadership, I do think, some organizations could have very bold leaders who said, we think it is right, before we get into the worst of climate crisis, to build up national organizations, because this model will break under major climate emergency. And therefore we have to change our business model. Therefore, if we are a $2 billion organization like the ICRC or something, you would say, right, $1 billion of that we will keep on our core, business around protection, whatever, where we think there's an internationalist dimension that's important. $1 billion, the other $1 billion, we will now invest in national societies, so that in 5 years' time, if an airdrop is needed in South Sudan, it'll be a South Sudanese Red Cross operation that does that, not an ICRC one. If food convoys are needed into Tigray, it'll be an Ethiopian Red Cross one, or whatever. And that, I think, would be a very bold decision about using that money differently. Whether you could avoid paternalism there, because you instead of being an operations person being paternalistic, you'd then be a fund manager, if you like, being paternalistic potentially. So it's always difficult. And that's where Aarathi's point about personal positioning comes in, because if you have a commitment to work in solidarity, in a way that I do see it in some of the Christian organizations, the real commitment to partnership, and in Oxfam at its best, then that positionality will bring a change.
Yes. As we come to you, Aarathi, I see that Tileke share valuing resources each partner bring to the table beyond money may be an essential step. Without relations, context, knowledge, money will not reach purpose. Aarathi, for you, the same question on your ideal world where organizations need to reflect their raison d'etre and their relationship between the so-called donor and giver. How do you imagine a world where this, where you can provide development aid, as it's called, without being paternalistic?
Well, Audre Lorde, for those of you that know her work, once said, what does it mean when tools of a racist patriarchy are used to examine the fruits of that same patriarchy? It means that only the most narrow parameters of change are possible and permissible in our transformation efforts. We can't use the same tools that we've been using this whole time. We have, and again, I come back to my argument about expanding our knowledge sources to look at a much wider range of wisdom and truth to help guide us in very complex changing times. So do I imagine a humanitarian system that's not paternalistic? No, I don't think that actually is possible, because systems are made up of people and we are all human. And as humans, there are those that are wonderfully joyful and driving for equity and change, and there are those that are racist, there are those that are homophobic, there are those that are fundamentally cruel and evil. We can't imagine a system without suddenly imagining that everybody in that system ceases to be who they are. What we need to understand is, how do we mitigate the harms? How do we design a system that is as focused on mitigating the harms of our action, not just now, but into the future? And as Hugo has rightfully said multiple times, the climate crisis is upon us. We're moving into complex, compounding, conflating crises that our systems are not prepared right now to be fit for. So how do we think about mitigating the harm that we inflict? Are we suddenly going to be utopian human beings? No, but how do we be radical in our efforts and foster the kind of environment that those that are trying to drive this change within systems, outside of systems, within institutions, outside of institutions, can actually influence that? Hope is a radical act. Hope is an act of resistance. And if we want to not design the inequities of our past into the future, then we need to give space to those that are really fighting for these changes to happen. We're never going to be perfect human beings, but how do we ensure that those that are fighting for a more just, equal world can have a greater chance of success that is more equity driven, rather than what happens now where we kind of give up the inevitability of power being maintained in the few as if it's an inevitable truth of the world.
Yes.
I hope that makes sense, but yeah, I'm saying, I guess I'm trying to say.
Totally, I have the intention to go a bit further, and I'm looking at the time at the same time and trying to look at the contribution. Luckily, I see that Priya mentioned the point of reparations. So that was one of my last questions, linking aid to reparations and redistribution. Until we change our language outlook, we are not really changing. That is what Priya Nath said. And it's really touched on the points, the analysis that you've given about the nature of our world, including climate change. What is your reflection on the idea? I have two questions that are related, two ideas, maybe reparations for the damage that maybe the colonialism has contributed, or the unequal power relations, and some form of global tax for humanitarian and development interventions. What is your thought on this kind of proposal? And would that contribute to that equitable world that we want to work toward?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure I have a position, or I have a position at the moment on a global tax, not because I don't agree with it, but I haven't really put a lot of thought into that. But I want to come to, and I don't want to diminish the argument or the debate by putting forward an uninformed point of view. On reparations, will we ever get to a point in our humanity and in our world where we give back? I would like to think so. But but will it take the form of cash or funding? I don't know. I mean, I genuinely don't know. I think the argument of reparations is integral, but and also I would love to have a discussion around what form could that take. And the reason why I pause there is, we think about You know, the British Museum has got artifacts from all over the world that it essentially took under the guise of colonization, and it's still not given back. I mean, there are some efforts to give it back, but if museums, the sort of space of knowledge and learning and collective wisdom is still struggling with its own history in that space, then it's not a straightforward argument even in our sector. So I think that the very act of giving back must be central to the idea of a reimagined humanitarian system. And I would love further discussions around what form could that take.
Wow. Hugo?
Yeah, so I think, you know, we have in the climate agreements at the moment, we have the principle of reparations in the policy of loss and damage. And I think humanitarians should really get behind that, because I think in the next few years, the kind of communities that we tend to work with who are really, you know, struggling most, I think we've got to find a way of funneling that loss and damage finance down towards them wherever they are. And they may not be staying where they are, but moving all the time. So I think that reparations principle is there, and we must really, in the next 2 to 3 years, as a profession and community, work out how we leverage loss and damage money in people's interests so that it really does, in a sense, repair the real burden that they've had to face, which, you know, Western industrial powers have largely made, and China now as well. On reparations for aid as such, you know, in the profession at the moment, I can sort of see the logic, but I never finally end up convinced by reparations or aid as reparations. And partly because, I mean, we probably could work out a way that we could try and find some sum of money that repaired the suffering that Aarathi's grandfather endured on the, you know, making railways for the British and things like that, and the relocation and, you know, forced displacement and movement in a way of so many people by empire, by the British Empire. We could maybe find a sum for that. But then, you know, and I honestly feel this because having seen so much of it in my own life, then we'd have to subtract the many, many people killed, starved, died, displaced because of the actions after independence by very unpleasant people who captured African states politically and were responsible for massacres and dispossessions and impoverishment as well. So it would be quite a complicated sum. And I also, you know, I'm not sure how we would do it. And I think it may be too late.
Maybe to push you hard on that.
There may be other ways for
maybe to
people to say sorry to Aarathi's family and to others' families and that sort of things, if that's the way.
Maybe to push a bit further, because it's more, I think, a judicial question. Without necessarily going back to the past, one could look, for instance, at a country like Congo, where I come from, and how the suffering of people from my province are related to our global consumptions, or how our consumption contributes to climate catastrophes across the world in countries like Afghanistan. So the question then really becomes, in the world where we are interconnected and the pleasure of one is related to the pain of the other, what is the role and the responsibility of humanitarian organizations to work toward a just system? Is it, on one hand, using the money of the rich country to help the impoverished, or is there a way to, because we are having a moral question today, to reflect a different perspective where reparations, not necessarily of the past, but of contemporary injustice, become part of the conversation?
Yes, and I think maybe loss and damage in climate will provide us, if we work it well, with a precedent for other areas. But again, morally, it's complicated even in the Congo, you know, because yes, the incredibly appalling extraction economy, first by the Belgians, then by others, and you know, the cynical use of coup and assassination by the Americans in that country around independence and that sort of thing. That's, of course, that's huge damage to a society. And you know, you could try and find a way to calculate that. But, you know, then if you're looking at the stuff that's in mobile phones, you might then have to say, but mobile phones are actually being used to good across the Congo and across parts of Africa today. So how do we subtract the fact that this rare earth in phones creates public goods and individual goods as well for people? So I think it's just a complicated thing to do. And I wonder whether we shouldn't just be focusing forward on climate change. I don't mean to dodge the question, but let's get loss and damage right there, and really use it. But,
Yes.
but maybe I'm wrong.
Aarathi, I see you're nodding on my question on the Congo and the use of coltan for global pleasure. What's your reflection? Could we use, could reparation be a way to
yeah, I hear you, Kiza. I'm sort of in between both your question and Hugo's response. I think there is an obligation to give back in some way, whether it's for past harm or future harm. And my cat agrees still. But I do also agree, and because these are the current contemporary analysis on reparations that we hear and read about today, that it's a really complex piece of work. And Hugo talked about that. So I'm interested to understand what other forms could giving back, or the concept of giving back, to atone for past harm, to mitigate against future harm, look like. And perhaps those are some of those strands that we have been talking about, but it's not looking. I mean, is it cash in hand? Maybe. I genuinely don't know. I'm not coming with a position, but maybe it's about maybe the act of localizing a humanitarian actors and reducing the amount of foreign boots on the ground and providing those opportunities to local humanitarian actors and paying them appropriately is one of those acts. Ensuring, so there are different strands in which I think we can potentially design under the philosophy of giving back, so that but it may not necessarily look like cash. I genuinely don't know the answer to this. I think it's a complex question. Philosophically, I think there needs to be that principle woven in, not just for the past, but for the future. But what shape that takes, I am at a loss, same as Hugo, because I think it needs brains much bigger than mine to come in, and much more diverse brains to think about that. I don't think it should just look as cash as one mechanism, but through a variety of approaches that could help us get there. But
yes,
yeah.
Thank you very much. At the end, it's always about money, even when we're talking about ethics. I remember Hugo was saying it's about wrong and right and not necessarily about money, but as the conversation evolved and also the participants, it really ended up being about power relations and choices and trade-offs. And what I took is that we should really think about our own positions in the world and how that influenced our gaze. I see some comments coming in. We'll do our best to include them. For you, Aarathi and Hugo, the opportunities for some conclusive words, because normally it's Thea Hillhorst who I give the floor, but she's not with us today. For me, it was an interesting open reflection where I was surprised and I learned a lot. And at the broker, I would really do our best to write an accessible article, because it was a lot to digest, but I'm sure we will succeed and to spread the word further, also including the links that were shared in the article. Some last reflective words, starting with you, Hugo.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And I've learned a lot too and enjoyed it. And I think for me, the key thing is that it's helped me continue to reflect. I got to start learning to use this word positionality, but I mean, on my position and on my thinking. And bizarrely, one of the joys of getting older is that I think if you take your life with curiosity, you keep learning, you have to keep challenging yourself and keep thinking. And that's what I'll do. And then in terms of the power issues, sitting in Oxford in a university, one can change some things, not everything. And I think, you have to decide where you can leverage most influence. And I think that's what else I'll try and do, to try and make sure we do get a better Western aid system. I'm not sure we can control whatever the Chinese and others come up with, but let's get a better Western aid system that's paid for by the West, that is fair, that is not imperial, not colonial, and is just and enables self-determination of humanitarian institutions by cultures all over the world, so that we do not dominate those cultures.
Thank you very much, Aarathi. By the way, Aarathi, I saw you smiled when Hugo said Western aid system.
Yeah, I wonder if that's what our future will be. Will we still have like Western aid systems? Or
Yeah, that's why I smiled, because you
Yeah.
made a point about principles and the importance of questioning those. I'm
Yeah.
so sorry you didn't even dive in that.
No, that's okay. Hugo, thank you. Genuinely, I learned so much from you all the time. And Kiza, thank you for such wonderful questions, and to the participants. I think, you know, one of the things I've been learning over the last 2 years, and I talked about this earlier, is unshackling my own mental models, and the roles I have felt that I have been forced to play, and how do I become more authentic and true to myself and to my roots and to my history and to my ancestors as part of that. And that's my personal reflection. Like, and Hugo is so honest and so humble about his history. And I think we all ought to be as well. So I want to talk about the rawness and vulnerability that these sorts of processes can bring up for all of us, and to give space for that. Because they're integral in any kind of change process. And I read a lot. I'm a bit of a nerd. I'm very much a nerd, but I get influenced by so many different authors. And Adrienne Marie Brown, if you haven't read her, she's written this book called Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds. And she talked about imagination. And I think a lot about imagination because I work in Foresight. But I just want to end with this. We are in an imagination battle. Imagination turns brown bombers into terrorists and white bombers into mentally ill victims. Imagination gives us borders, gives us superiority, gives us race as an indicator of ability. I often feel I am trapped inside someone else's capability and imagination. I often feel I'm trapped inside someone else's ideas. And I must engage my own imagination in order to break free. I don't think the tools of our past are equipped for what we want to imagine for our futures, not just for us, but for our children and our grandchildren, for future generations. And I think we must unleash our collective wisdom, the wisdom of our ancestors, but also our own imaginations to break free of these shackles that we think we have to subscribe to. Thank you, Kiza, Peter, Hugo, wonderful. I've learned so much. It was a privilege. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I see people asking whether you could share the text with us. If that's the case, I'll be happy to share it afterwards, also in the article. Thank you again. I think this is the time to mention that we have a final session. I don't know whether we can see that on the screen, where we will focus on the role of the donor, because I think in the previous conversation, there was a lot discussion about the donor has been presented as the monster, but it's important to reflect about where the money comes from and how that contributes to the conversation that we are having, the decolonial process. I would like to thank you again, Aarathi and Hugo and KUNO and Partos, for giving me the opportunity to lead this conversation. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you next time.